Hey friends, and welcome back again to Trying to with Leah. If you're new here, thank you so much for being here. On my channel, I share my own story of transformation along with the experiences that I'm still living through every single day. And together we explore mindset shifts and habits and perspective changes that have helped me overcome anxiety, depression, overthinking, and procrastination. If that sounds like something that could help you, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me every week. So today we're going to talk about something that I think every single one of us has probably struggled with at some point in time, and that is procrastination. And I've actually come to really strongly dislike that word because it's usually tied to some kind of negative connotations. When I think of procrastination, I usually think of laziness and lack of discipline and choosing not to try hard enough. And that's kind of how people talk about it, isn't it? Just stop procrastinating. You just have to start. And they act like it's just so simple. But after spending years of trying to understand myself, I've started kind of looking at procrastination differently because most of the time I don't actually think it's the problem itself. It's a symptom of a bigger problem. Usually for me, procrastination is really one of two things. It's either analysis paralysis or it's emotional overwhelm. So if you haven't heard of it, analysis paralysis is when your brain is trying so hard to make the perfect decision the right way that it really can't make any decisions at all. It just kind of becomes frozen. It's when you imagine every possible scenario and every possible outcome and every mistake you could possibly make and everything that could possibly go wrong. And eventually your brain becomes so overwhelmed that doing nothing actually feels a lot safer than making a choice. And then there's emotional overwhelm. And that's when the thing itself isn't really that complicated, but emotionally it feels completely overwhelming. And maybe that's making a phone call or having a difficult conversation with someone or starting a business or writing the first chapter of a book. Maybe it's just cleaning your room that's kind of gotten out of control. But sometimes it's not even really the task that we're avoiding. It's usually the emotion that we expect to feel while we're doing that task. And when those emotions get big enough, our nervous system basically slams on the brakes for us. So instead of moving forward, we end up freezing. I have spent a lot of time over the years completely frozen. But now I understand that my nervous system just kind of thought it was protecting me, because that's what it's meant to do. It's to keep us from danger. But not every overwhelming thing is physically dangerous. And that was something that my nervous system had to realize. So instead of getting overwhelmed by the emotions, when those feelings came up, I started to ask myself, what is my brain actually trying to protect me from here? And usually it's not an actual physical danger. It's just change. Because change is uncomfortable. Even good change can be uncomfortable. And if you think about it, our brains love patterns because patterns are predictable and patterns feel safe and familiar to us. So even when we're unhappy, even when we really desperately want to experience something different, our brain would usually just rather stay within what's familiar, instead of facing the unknown. I think that's why people stay in jobs that they hate and relationships that are not really healthy for them. And they keep, doing the same habits that are not benefiting them. And it's not because they want to suffer, but it's because their brain knows what to expect. Changing means stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty feels scary. There's a quote about the definition of insanity being doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And most of us, I think, spend our lives doing exactly that. But if we really want our lives to change, we have to change. We have to change our habits and our reactions and our choices. And yes, that can feel very scary at times. But sometimes the first step feels impossible because we're imagining the entire journey instead of just the first step. I've done that so many times. I'll look at a project, and instead of seeing today's tasks, I see every task for every day, every future problem, every possible scenario, and every obstacle. And my brain is trying to solve the entire year's worth of problems before I've even started on today's problems. So no wonder we feel overwhelmed when we do that, but luckily I have realized that there is always a smallest possible step. Always. So let's say that you're planning a huge birthday party and the whole thing feels completely overwhelming. And your brain starts thinking about decorations and food and cake, invites, music, timing, money, cleanup, everything. And suddenly your heart rate is up before you've even started anything. So I like to focus on shrinking the problem. Maybe the first step isn't planning the whole party. Maybe it's just opening up your notes app and making a list, or writing birthday party at the top of a piece of paper if that's what it takes. Maybe it's ordering the cake or deciding on a date, but it's one tiny thing. It's just one small step for you to take. And then all you have to do is take another step, and another and another. And that's actually how I have gotten to the point where I'm still almost nearly 100 pounds down. I talk about this all the time, but it started with one lap, and I just increased and increased as I could. And that's kind of what I've done with every change that I've made in my life, just making small, consistent, intentional changes, because I think that's where actual transformation happens. It's not really in giant bursts of motivation. Those can be exciting and you get a lot of things done, but they usually don't last. Consistency is what lasts. Tiny steps over time lasts, and momentum lasts. And I've also noticed that the more intentionally that I move towards things that scare me, the quieter that fear actually becomes, because I remind myself that I have consistently survived everything that life has thrown my way. I've made it through, and usually it's not perfectly, and it's never gracefully, but I always survive. And when you really think about it, every difficult season that you've ever been through, you've survived too, because you're still here. And that doesn't mean that the fear wasn't real, because it definitely was real, but it does mean that I'm stronger than the fear. Eventually life is going to force us to move, whether we want to move or not. Jobs change and people leave and unexpected things keep happening, and life just kind of keeps moving. So really, we only have a couple of choices. We can resist every change that happens and just kind of go through our life kicking and screaming, or we can start moving intentionally, taking one small step at a time. And that's where I think understanding your nervous system becomes so important. For most of my life, I did not fully understand what it meant to live in survival mode. And it wasn't actually until I started playing Minecraft with my son that I got it. It started to sink in, because you are anxious. You are terrified of all of these creatures and monsters and things like that, especially at night, So it is, it's quite the experience, but it is very insightful in a lot of ways. When your nervous system isn't being listened to, it kind of views everything as an emergency. But emotions are not always emergencies. Sometimes they're just information. Sometimes they're just trying to tell us to slow down, or to look at something specific and start paying attention. And sometimes they're just reminders of what we've overcome and how far we've come. And once I understood that, I stopped fighting my emotions every time they came up, and I just started, instead of asking, how do I get rid of this feeling, I started asking, what is this feeling trying to tell me? What am I trying to show myself here? And that gave me compassion for myself instead of having this constant criticism. It allowed me to have curiosity instead of going straight to shame. And over time, those emotional waves become easier to ride, because you get better at working with your emotions instead of trying to fight against them all the time. I've always believed that every single one of us is living our own story, and the experiences that we have teach us things about ourselves. And usually those lessons are true, but sometimes they're not. Maybe your life taught you that you're not capable, or maybe it taught you that you're too much or that you're not enough. Maybe it taught you that failing means that you are a failure, which is definitely not true. But those stories become the lens that we see our own lives through. And lucky for us, we can rewrite those stories if we want. Now, I know that there are always going to be people who do not want to change, and that's okay. One of the hardest lessons that I've ever had to learn is that you have to really let people make their own choices. You cannot force somebody to grow, and you can't force someone to heal, and you can't make somebody look inward if they are not ready to. That choice belongs to them, just like your choice belongs to you and mine belongs to me. So for this week's challenge, think about something that you've been procrastinating doing, not something that somebody else wants you to do, but something that actually matters to you personally. For me, it's going to be writing. I have spent so much time building up my YouTube channel and growing my eBay business that writing kind of got pushed to the back burner. So it's to get back into some writing, because writing brings me a lot of joy. And I realized I wasn't really avoiding it because I didn't love it anymore. I was just kind of overwhelmed by everything else that was competing for my attention. So this week I am bringing writing back into my life, and I'm doing that one choice at a time. Maybe it's just going to be 15 minutes, and maybe it's going to be a full page, but whatever it looks like, that's okay, because progress does not happen all at once. It happens by making one intentional choice at a time. So, what is your smallest step? Not the whole mountain, just the first smallest step. I would love to hear it, so put it in the comments below and let me know what you're working on this week. Maybe we can encourage each other along the way. So keep trying, because life really does get better when you try. I'll see you guys next week, and thank you so much for spending this time with me.